This is Indie Film Forum and I'm Kalpana Biswas. My guest today is Billy Jackson, a social activist, award-winning documentary filmmaker and professor who has brought to screen some of the most searing aspects of our national experience. An early film, Enough is Enough, examined the killing of Jonny Gammage, a black motorist, at the hands of the police during a routine traffic stop. His latest work, A Quiet Soldier, profiles the military resistance of Pittsburgh Attorney Wendell Freeland as a Tuskegee Airman during World War II. In Didn't We Ramble On, he uncovers the African roots of our traditional marching bands. The overlooked cultural impact of Black arts and music are celebrated in We Are Universal, and Pass It On, about the great jazz percussionist Roger Humphries. Billy Jackson. Billy Jackson, welcome. You've been an activist filmmaker for pretty much all your life, and I wondered which came first.
Yeah, I think I got started as an artist first. I started in still photography, doing fashion photography, realized the limitations of that, wanted it to have more of a voice. During my senior year of undergraduate, I wrote a proposal to the National Endowment of the Arts to do a documentary on the Black is Beautiful movement back in the 70s. And I think it went on from there. I was living in Boston at the time, did freelance for various TV channels up there. Also worked with Black Side Incorporated, it's the producers of Eyes on the Prize.
You were in New York, you were at Harvard, and then you came to Pittsburgh.
Right.
So all of that experience, I mean, what did you bring from each of these very interesting places to Pittsburgh?
That's a long discussion. I don't know that we can get to it in this sitting, but I principally from Boston at the time I was there in the 60s and 70s, I was doing busing. So that was very political then as well, and I think I probably got a little smattering of that. From my graduate work, I did some study in visual environmental studies at MIT, and that's when, back in those days, they had the bullet going through a wall or milk being poured on the table, and you see it in slow motion. So I did some work in that with Black Side and got into looking at visual thinking, and I had Rudolf Arnheim as one of my teachers there, and he was the Gestalt, the visual thinker, and he got to me looking at the work that I do and the work I wanted to do more from a visual perspective rather than a literal or perspective. And I worked with Bill Greaves out of New York. He was one of the co-creators of Black Journal on WNET there. And I worked for him for a couple of years doing industrials and documentaries and that. And so from that, I brought the business. Early in the 70s, I started my own business. And then I also taught. I taught at Emerson College for 5 years in Boston. When I came back to Pittsburgh, because originally from Pittsburgh, left 65, came back in 85, I did some teaching at Pittsburgh Filmmakers, did some workshops, some community things, and then also I started a nonprofit organization called Community Media in 1989 that was around for about 12 years. And essentially what we did was we trained young adults how to tell stories on their own lives. And we took those stories, those documentaries, and as well other feature films that were award winners and really important cultural films. And we took them around to various communities all around Pittsburgh. Sometimes we'd roll up with a 10-foot screen and a generator and the projector and show them out in parks and in parking lots.
What did you see was the impact of it? I mean, the power of films.
The discernible impact that I've witnessed from pieces that I've worked on are two. One is on the documentary on the evolution of the black marching band. Because a lot of people didn't know that the bands that we know of today, whether they be college marching bands, New Orleans marching bands, whatever, came from West Africa, 14th century. That sort of blew everybody's hair back on that. And then the Jonny Gammage was another one that a lot of people didn't know all the particulars. We went into the coroner's transcript, 800 and some pages, and literally recreated a scene, when Jonny was actually killed. And then also presented all of the different aspects around his killing to give a good, well-balanced recap of his murder.
And I'd like you to sort of walk us through the whole process.
First of all, it wasn't planned. At that time, we had a group of interns who were training to tell their own stories in community media, and we were out shooting actually a piece on gangs. That was very important back in the early 90s. And then we heard about Jonny's murder, and it was just like, it was a no-brainer. We went down, and right away we started capturing the protests, and then it grew. We didn't plan on it being that long or that detailed, but we ended up shooting. I mean, a lot of people don't realize there were 3 people out of 5, those officers who were charged. There were 3 trials. Mm-hmm. We covered all of them. We went to New York, where Jonny was from, to interview his family and that. Then once we got it on the editing table, then it began to take shape. And I think that's what every project ends up being consummated and detailed is on the editing table. A lot of times you'll go in with plans. A lot of ones I do. Do the research is the first thing. And a lot of people don't want to do the research. But as we were talking earlier, some of the great interviewers, Charlie Rhodes, and on All Things Considered, and Terry Gross does her homework very well. I remember reading when I was studying documentaries, it always says, okay, you can't script what you're going to get because it's a documentary, you're firing from the hip. But what you do is you script what you want to get, and then that way, if you don't hit the bullseye, you have a better idea of how close you are to what you want to do, or how close you need to be to what the subject dictates.
Let's look at a clip from Enough is Enough.
October 12, 1995. Brentwood police make a routine traffic stop just inside the Pittsburgh city limits.
Was I going over the speed limit?
Hey! I said stop moving around! Get out of the car! Just let me explain. No!
John was a very laid-back person, a person that wanted a lot out of life.
He was a genuinely caring person.
Minutes later, a young black businessman takes his final breath.
Mr. Gammage died as a result of compression or positional asphyxiation. This man had committed no crime. He was not a fleeing felon.
His death was outrageous.
His life was taken away from him. We were robbed.
We will support the police where they deserve support, and where they are wrong, we will seek them out.
The Brentwood Police Department was just an organization run amok. The police chief, George Swinney, personally was administering anabolic steroids to John Votis in the police station.
A police officer of that type is more likely to use violence in a situation in the community.
The conduct of the officers caused the death itself.
I believed that the case didn't merit the prosecution.
I know in my mind I did what I was trained to do.
Proper training. That's not proper training.
That's right.
Dogs have more rights than was shown Jonny Gammage in this case. Right.
I've never heard as many white people come up to me on the street and say, stay at that. That was wrong.
If somebody had been truly honest with us and said, yes, I did press on his back, I didn't realize what was going on, then I think we may have found for manslaughter. But when you cover something up, that makes you feel like you're being used.
They're not bringing out all the truth in those courtrooms.
The answer you gave, I used them one time before. That was your answer, right?
One time before, yes, sir. Meaning in the past, yes, sir.
That was a lie, wasn't it?
It's not a lie, sir.
You used them for years, didn't you?
Well, that's what I meant by that.
14 months later, Mulholland and Albert again faced the bar of justice. Another mistrial.
The most alarming fact in the Charmo case, of the death of Jerry Jackson, was the fact that 51 bullets, 10 more than Amadou Diallo in New York, were fired into a tunnel at a man who had only violated, at the moment, traffic violations.
Officer Charmo claims that Jackson made a U-turn in the tunnel, thus making his vehicle a deadly weapon. There was no U-turn.
The investigators on the scene should have known that Jackson could not have turned his vehicle around in that very narrow tunnel.
That was just straight out being covered up.
To be frank, most of the shots occurred after the vehicle was at rest.
Grassroots support to establish a citizen police review board gained strength citywide.
Demand that this city council and this mayor support putting the question on the ballot in the spring primary, because we need it.
We have to let people know, wake up, look what's going on around you, get involved.
Out of that came the basis for the lawsuit that led to Pittsburgh being the first city in the nation to be monitored by a consent decree of the federal government.
There's a remarkable difference when the federal government investigates the case and when the state investigates it. You could see all the officers acquitted in Rodney King's state criminal trial, and then when the federal government went back and looked at the same evidence, they were convicted.
Like bad lawyers, like others, there are people who abuse their authority.
The Blue Shield was intended to protect officers who are doing the right thing, not to protect those who are guilty.
You can't have any special rules for police officers.
If the police are your abusers, if the police are the ones that are killing your children, where are you to turn?
You just kill a black person, he was just dead.
We have to make sure that Jonny Gammage didn't die in vain.
When we decide that enough is enough, it's going to stop.
We must stop being silent. Silence is killing us.
Don't ask whose door they're knocking on tonight or last night. They're always knocking on your door.
It's extraordinarily powerful. What were the challenges you faced in actually making that film?
There were many. Budget's always a problem. You know, how much money can you bring to the table in order to get it done? Another thing was the resistance from the police. We gave an opportunity for all law enforcement people who are involved in it, as well people in the courts. Well, we did get some judges, and they were very forthcoming. But none of the 5 cops, none of their supervisors, the chief of police at the time, none of them wanted to cooperate. So that was another problem we had. But I think that was the biggest problem, was just the gathering of information.
Thereafter, though, you had a number of showings of the film. You had panel discussions, you had community meetings. You were ahead of your time, I guess, the Black Lives Matter and the Blue Lives Matter kinds of issues that we are now sort of dealing with.
Still is a lightning rod. Whenever you look at law enforcement, when you look at overreaction, nothing's new. The thing with Castile, with Jonny Gammage, it was at 2 o'clock in the morning. The only people who were there were the paramedics and the cops. Those are the witnesses. And a lot of them did not want to be involved. But Jonny Gammage particularly, I think the biggest problem there was of just getting people to come forward. And still, as I said, it's a lightning rod, because what in fact, people realize nothing's changed. And so what do we need to do? I remember when we screened that documentary, it was an hour format. And the channel that aired it wanted me to cut it down by 4 minutes. Those 4 minutes were the last 4 minutes in which we really summarized what do we as a people need to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. So my feeling was, okay, it still won awards, but the reply was it wouldn't be as engaging. Well, my concern was it not only needs to be engaging, it needs to be motivating. So that people will then follow up on what they need to do in order to preclude that happening again.
Another important documentary that you made is The Quiet Soldier. I didn't know that we actually had a Tuskegee Airman living in Pittsburgh, Wendell Freeland. You got him to talk about his life and his resistance. And this was 8 years before Rosa Parks sat at in the front of the bus. And so he also led a sort of sit-in.
First, the correction to the record. Okay. There are a considerable number number of Tuskegee Airmen who have lived in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Wendell was one of them. He's one of the last surviving. He was one of the last surviving. There were several others. Matter of fact, I even had a cousin who was a mechanic for the Tuskegee Airmen down, during World War II. And he didn't get his glory, nor did a lot of the other ones get recognized. But there's a larger number of Tuskegee Airmen in Pittsburgh than in most other American cities. And there's a memorial to them out in Sewickley now, which Regis Babonis was instrumental before he just passed in the last year to get recognition for all of the Tuskegee Airmen who are out there. And people need to go out and, to Sewickley and look at it and see all the names from that area. And the name for the documentary, Wendell Freeland, A Quiet Soldier, is because he was always in the background. He was quiet. First of all, he was able to be in the background because he was very light-skinned. So white people didn't know that he was black, and many black people didn't know that he was black. So he was able to blend in. He could go from one side of the line to the other where people were at battle, at odds, and be able to exchange information for both sides. And his rapport was such that he was able to relate to everybody and help people to come to the bargaining table.
Well, let's take a look at a clip from The Quiet Soldier.
In my generation, I was born in 1925. I finished law school in 1950. In my generation of Negroes, Negro lawyers, we got with our LLB or with our law degrees a ticket to a civil rights fight. So when I went into the service, I learned that because I knew my serial number and because I'd been to college, that I was technically useful as a Tuskegee Airman. They didn't call us that then, but they said we had a new program for Negroes to fly. Of course, the beginning of the war, beginning of World War II, there was no thought that Negroes could fly. In fact, it's so funny, so funny. Bigots have so many ideas. They said, well, they can't fly. But then somebody said, well, maybe they can fly, and maybe they're like cats, they can see better at night. So maybe they can fly better at night. And that's the craziest damn thing one could hear. But that's what racism is all about, reciting crazy things that nobody in his right mind would believe. My mother, who lived to 101, and one morning she called me and she said, I've lived long enough to vote for a colored man for mayor of Baltimore City. I had that same feeling when I voted for Barack Obama in 2008. I have lived long enough to vote for a colored man for President of the United States. But to quote an old hero of mine, a Democrat, Adlai Ewing Stevenson, progress is not a measured tread. In other words, one does not go from here, 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 always up. History has its ebbs and flows. And where we are now is a dark time. We've been at other dark times in our history as a people, not just as Negroes, but as American people. When the Supreme Court and some parts of the other governments have made it very hard for us to make progress. But we have to keep fighting. Just file the next case, attack the next law. If we believe that we are right, we will eventually win. It's not because we're on God's side, as Joe Louis said in World War II. Yeah. It's because we're on the right side.
I think it's a really important work. You also had the film about the marching bands.
That project was done after I had done the documentary on the Black is Beautiful movement, which is called We Are Universal. The soundtrack that was in there was done by Dr. Carl Atkins, who was at that time at New England Conservatory. Carl had started his dissertation on that the marching bands. Very few knew that it had originated in West Africa with a Yoruba. It's a very visual subject, and music as well. And I'm glad you asked me about that, because I saw a parallel between my shooting that and the shooting that I saw in the work that you're currently doing over in Afghanistan. Certainly the chips were not as large with mine as with yours, because with you, I mean, you sacrificed life in order to get that documentary, and for which, you know, you have my ultimate respect. When we went down to New Orleans, one of the 3 places we shot a jazz funeral procession, and we set up with one of the marching bands down there to offer their services to somebody who had just passed away, so that we could then shoot the second line in the marching band and the whole 9 yards. But in New Orleans, that's their bread and butter, so that's how they make money. They have got unions. They do not allow people to come in and shoot unless you go through the unions, and we tried to go through the unions, and the price was exorbitant. So I had to shoot it out of a station wagon. The back of a station wagon as they went down and proceeded. So but the whole time I'm in that station wagon, I'm just waiting for a union rep or somebody to come up and say, where's your permit? As you know, those are the kind of things that you have to do in order to get the story that you need.
A woman sings to her child. A man dances. A person dies. And the old teach the young how to commemorate. The children remember, and they teach their children that this music is their home. The spirit is everlasting. It marches with the people through the generations. It is an amazing thing to watch a marching band from New Orleans or Florida A&M, that type marching band that sticks to a tradition that has been on the scene for 700 years.
Again, a fascinating piece. You were an independent filmmaker, and yet you had the kind of access that I think people would give a right arm for. You had Danny Glover narrating, you had Dizzy Gillespie narrating.
2 different situations. Dizzy Gillespie, I met him through Gary Bartz, who I'm still working on a documentary out of my pocket on for the last 22, 23, maybe 24 years now. And when he found out about the history of the marching band, and I mean, Dizzy is, you know, he was the man. And then we had good rapport. We had good synergy, and we got that, you know, the narration done. He's not a narrator. It took a while, and I had a person who's in the union in New York, really great cameraman. We shot him in DC. We were able to get a good piece out of it, shooting and editing around it. With Danny Glover, it's different. I didn't know Danny, but we're both involved in the same thing, the social activism that you referred to earlier. And so when you're in the struggle, you have comrades, and you have to recognize that the resources that you have more often than not are people, not money, not institutions, not the racism that's around you, or the myopic perception of life, you know, around you. So there, it was a matter of approaching him, and you know, Danny Glover donated that. I mean, so, you know, he's not easy to get a hold of, It took a while to consummate the time and everything, but ultimately we got it done.
In all of this, what insights did you garner in these decades of work with documentary filmmaking? And I think particularly important documentary projects, because they're so significant, socially so significant.
What you last said was really critical, documentary genre format. Because until recently, until you had a lot of the news gathering agencies like CNN and Fox and all those who really went out to locations, took their news gathering out of the studio into the world, documentaries weren't as much of people's diet. And now it's becoming more. I used to, when I was teaching, one quiz I'd give my students from the door. Name me 3 documentary filmmakers. Nobody could name them, you know. And to this day, not many can, because everybody thinks it's dramatic. You know, think of Spielberg, or they think of Gordon Parks, or, you know, John Singleton and Spike Lee and all those people. Right away, they think of them. And I'm thinking more from where my focus is, and that is black filmmaking. But now, some names are surfacing. What I've learned from my experience coming back to Pittsburgh is, first of all, Pittsburgh is not a media center. You know, it's not the place that you want to go to develop your career or expect to get a lot of work out of or expect to get a lot of support from. It's increasing, it's getting better, but it's behind the curve by at least 10 years of most other media producing cities. The second thing is people don't stick together as well here in Pittsburgh as I've witnessed in Boston and particularly in New York. Filmmakers don't share, they don't collaborate, they don't support or participate with one another as much as they did there. And so consequently, there's not that synergy here that there needs to be or should be or could be. And then I think the last thing is the funding for it is very difficult. It's very competitive now. Medias are very competitive, but I think the effort is worth it. I'm obligated to train and to inspire, influence, and to help others coming behind me so that there will be storytellers once I've gone.
You talk about you're rooted in the black culture, black filmmaking, and you've mentioned that several times. How do you see that as different from the mainstream, and what has made it different?
Yeah, I know you're not being intentionally facetious.
No, I'm not. I think what I was talking about was less about the content, less about the issues per se, and which are absolutely right. But does that impact the way you film, your technique? Is it guerrilla filmmaking much more than others? Is there a particular way of sort of making your films that's particularly conducive to the kinds of documentaries that you're making?
What's focused in the kind of subjects I choose, the way in which I choose them, the way in which I depict them and develop them is what our needs are, you know, as a people, as a black people. I think what our needs are is to be aware, number one, of what it is, where we came from, you know, who we are, and what we share in common and what we need to do in order to make a positive contribution to the society in which we live. All of that shapes what I choose to do and how I do it in and of itself by its very vernacular, you know, the fact that there are challenges. And how do we rise to those challenges? My first documentary was called We Are Universal. It was based on the Black is Beautiful movement. The movement now is Black Lives Matter. Nothing's changed. Back in the days when we were saying black is beautiful, the majority population said all colors are beautiful. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're not worried about all colors. We have some work we need to do on our own. And so consequently, black is beautiful, and that's what we're looking at. And don't detract from it, you know. And the same thing, Black Lives Matter, you know, they want to say all lives matter. Of course all lives matter. But more importantly, we're looking at black lives right now, because they're the ones under siege.
Very, very
well, I hope
important. Thank you so much, Billy. And thank you for watching Indie Film Forum. For more information about Billy Jackson and Indie Film Forum, please visit our websites. Coming up.